What happens when one of Hollywood's most outspoken stars sits across from a panel that isn't afraid to challenge him? What starts as a routine interview quickly turns into one of the most talked about moments of the morning as Pedro Pascal joins the table and finds himself in an unexpectedly heated exchange with Whoopi Goldberg. Make sure to subscribe to the Star Talks and like and comment for more talk show coverage. Whoopi Goldberg. Welcome back, everybody. We are joined by an actor audiences around the world absolutely love. You know him from television, film, and just about every project people can't stop talking about. Please welcome Pedro Pascal. Applause. Pedro Pascal. Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a very generous introduction. Joy Behar. The audience seems pretty excited to see you. Pedro Pascal. They're making me feel very welcome, which is great because live television always makes me nervous. Audience laughs. Sunny Hostin, really? You don't seem nervous. Pedro Pascal. That's because years of acting have taught me how to hide it. Audience laughs. Whoopi Goldberg. That's the job. Pedro Pascal. Exactly. Whoopi Goldberg. You've had an incredible few years. Everywhere people look, there you are. Movies, television, interviews. Has life changed in a way you didn't expect? Pedro Pascal. Absolutely. The strangest thing is that people think they know you because they've seen you so much. It's very flattering, but it's also a little surreal. Alyssa Farah Griffin. Does it ever become overwhelming? Pedro Pascal, sometimes. Most people are wonderful. They'll say hello, ask for a picture, tell me they enjoyed something I've worked on. But there are moments when you realize you don't really have anonymous days anymore. Joy Behar. That's the price of fame. Pedro Pascal. It is. And I'm fortunate. I remind myself of that constantly. Whoopi Goldberg. You've also become known for speaking your mind. Pedro Pascal. Sometimes more than my publicist would like. Audience laughs. Sunny Hostin. Do you ever regret saying what you think publicly? Pedro Pascal. Not really. I think people should be thoughtful about what they say, but I also think authenticity matters. Whoopi Goldberg. Here's where I get curious. A lot of celebrities today speak on every issue imaginable. Politics, culture, social debates. Do you ever worry that actors are taking up too much space in conversations that should belong to experts? Audience murmurs. Pedro Pascal. That's a fair question. Whoopi Goldberg. Because people listen to celebrities differently. Sometimes more than they listen to people who actually work in those fields. Pedro Pascal. I understand that concern. But I don't think speaking as a citizen means you're pretending to be an expert. Whoopi Goldberg. Sometimes it can look that way, though. Pedro Pascal. It can. And I think people should be careful about that. Whoopi Goldberg. But do you think celebrities are careful enough? Pedro Pascal. Some are. Some aren't. Just like anyone else. Joy Behar. That's probably the safest answer possible. Audience laughs. Pedro Pascal. I knew I was walking into a trap. Whoopi Goldberg. It's not a trap. It's a real question. Pedro Pascal. And it's a good one. Whoopi Goldberg. Because sometimes it feels like every issue immediately becomes a celebrity discussion. People start looking for actors to tell them what to think. Pedro Pascal. I don't want anyone looking to me for instructions. Whoopi Goldberg. Yet when celebrities make public statements, that's exactly what can happen. Pedro Pascal. But isn't that more about how audiences respond than about the person speaking? Whoopi Goldberg. Not entirely. Audience grows quieter. Pedro Pascal. I think everyone has a right to participate in public conversations. Whoopi Goldberg. Nobody's saying they don't. Pedro Pascal. Then we're probably closer in agreement than it sounds. Sunny Hostin. I actually think there's a balance. Public figures can speak up, but they should acknowledge their limitations. Pedro Pascal. Absolutely. Whoopi Goldberg. Okay, but let's push this a little further. Pedro Pascal. Here we go. Audience laughs. Whoopi Goldberg. No, seriously. You've become someone whose comments get headlines. Whether you intend it or not, your words carry influence. Doesn't that create a responsibility? Pedro Pascal. Of course it does. Whoopi Goldberg. And what does that responsibility look like? Pedro Pascal. Being honest. Being informed. Being willing to listen when you're wrong. Whoopi Goldberg. Listening seems to be the hardest part these days. Pedro Pascal. I agree with that. Whoopi Goldberg. Yet public debates often become people talking at each other. Pedro Pascal. That's because outrage gets attention. Audience applauds. Whoopi Goldberg. That's true. Pedro Pascal. Calm discussions don't usually trend online. Joy Behar, which is unfortunate because they're usually more productive. Pedro Pascal, exactly. Whoopi Goldberg, but sometimes calm discussions avoid hard truths. Pedro Pascal, sometimes. Whoopi Goldberg. And sometimes people use civility to dodge accountability. The audience reacts with a mix of applause and murmurs. Pedro Pascal, that's also true. Whoopi Goldberg. So when you speak publicly, how do you decide whether you're contributing something useful or simply adding more noise? Pedro Pascal pauses for a moment. Pedro Pascal. I ask myself whether I'm saying something because I genuinely believe it or because I know it'll get attention. Sunny Hostin. That's a good test. Pedro Pascal. It's not perfect, but it's the best one I've got. Whoopi Goldberg. And you've never failed that test. Pedro Pascal. Oh, I'm sure I have. Audience laughs. Whoopi Goldberg. That's honest. Pedro Pascal. I think everybody has moments they'd handle differently if they got another chance. Whoopi Goldberg. Fair enough. The conversation appears to settle, but the atmosphere remains noticeably serious. Alyssa Farah Griffin. One thing I've noticed is that people expect public figures to take a position on everything. Pedro Pascal. That's exhausting. Alyssa Farah Griffin. Is there pressure to respond immediately whenever something happens? Pedro Pascal. Constant pressure. Sometimes people assume silence means agreement. Other times they assume silence means opposition. Whoopi Goldberg. That's the reality of public life. Pedro Pascal. It is. But I think we're losing the ability to let people think before they speak. Audience applauds. Whoopi Goldberg, maybe. But some would argue people have had plenty of time to think. The audience lets out an audible ooh. Pedro Pascal smiles slightly. Pedro Pascal. I had a feeling we weren't done with this conversation. Whoopi Goldberg. Not even close. Audience laughs and applauds. Pedro Pascal. Well, let's keep going. Whoopi Goldberg. Good. Because I have one more question, and I think it's where this discussion gets interesting. Pedro Pascal. Oh. Whoopi Goldberg. No, seriously. If influence comes with responsibility, then should celebrities ever face criticism for speaking outside their expertise? The audience grows silent. Pedro Pascal leans forward in his chair. Pedro Pascal. Absolutely they should. Whoopi Goldberg raises an eyebrow. Whoopi Goldberg. Then we're about to have a very interesting conversation. Audience applauds loudly as the segment heads into a more intense discussion. Whoopi Goldberg. So if celebrities should face criticism when they speak outside their expertise, where do you draw the line? Pedro Pascal. I don't know if there's a clear line. Whoopi Goldberg. That's convenient. Audience reacts. Pedro Pascal. It's honest. Whoopi Goldberg. But if you're influencing millions of people, shouldn't you have a clearer answer than that? Pedro Pascal. I think the problem is that people expect certainty where there often isn't any. Whoopi Goldberg. That's not what I'm asking. Pedro Pascal. Then what are you asking? Whoopi Goldberg. I'm asking whether public figures sometimes underestimate the impact of what they say. Pedro Pascal. Some do. Whoopi Goldberg, including actors. Pedro Pascal. Including actors. Whoopi Goldberg. Including yourself. The audience lets out a collective ooh. Pedro Pascal pauses. Pedro Pascal. Probably at times, yes. Whoopi Goldberg. That's interesting. Pedro Pascal. Why? Whoopi Goldberg. Because a lot of celebrities never admit that. Pedro Pascal. Well, admitting it doesn't mean you stop having opinions. Whoopi Goldberg. Nobody said it did. Pedro Pascal. Sometimes it feels like that's exactly what's being suggested. Sunny Hostin. I don't think that's what Whoopi is saying. Pedro Pascal. Then maybe I'm misunderstanding. Whoopi Goldberg. Maybe you are. The audience grows quieter. Pedro Pascal. Okay. Help me understand. Whoopi Goldberg. What I'm saying is that influence isn't just about intention. Pedro Pascal. I agree. Whoopi Goldberg. You can mean well and still have consequences. Pedro Pascal. Absolutely. Whoopi Goldberg. Then why do so many public figures act surprised when they're criticized? Pedro Pascal. Because criticism today often feels less like disagreement and more like punishment. Audience applauds. Whoopi Goldberg. Sometimes criticism is deserved. Pedro Pascal. It can be. Whoopi Goldberg. And sometimes accountability is uncomfortable. Pedro Pascal. I agree with that too. Joy Behar. You two are arguing while agreeing. Audience laughs. Pedro Pascal. That's because we're talking about different parts of the same issue. Whoopi Goldberg, maybe. Pedro Pascal, no, seriously. Whoopi Goldberg, go ahead. Pedro Pascal, I think accountability matters. I also think we've created an environment where people are afraid to admit mistakes because every mistake becomes a permanent label. Audience members applaud. Sunny Hostin, that's a fair point. Whoopi Goldberg, but let's be careful here. Pedro Pascal, I'm listening. Whoopi Goldberg, sometimes people describe consequences as unfair simply because they don't like them. Pedro Pascal, that's true. Whoopi Goldberg, so how do we tell the difference? Pedro Pascal, context. Whoopi Goldberg, context according to who? Pedro Pascal, everybody involved. Whoopi Goldberg, that's messy. Pedro Pascal, human beings are messy. Audience laughs and applauds. Whoopi Goldberg, you're giving actor answers. Pedro Pascal, what's an actor answer? Whoopi Goldberg, one that sounds good but avoids a definitive position. The audience erupts with laughter and applause. Pedro Pascal smiles. Pedro Pascal, that's harsh. Whoopi Goldberg, it's honest. Pedro Pascal, okay, here's a definitive position. Whoopi Goldberg, finally. Pedro Pascal, people should be allowed to speak. People should also be allowed to challenge what they say. Whoopi Goldberg, that's not controversial. Pedro Pascal, it shouldn't be. Whoopi Goldberg, but that's not where the conflict happens. Pedro Pascal, then where does it happen? Whoopi Goldberg, it happens when people refuse to accept criticism. Pedro Pascal, agreed. Whoopi Goldberg, or when they want influence without responsibility. Pedro Pascal, agreed. Whoopi Goldberg, or when they use their platform to dominate conversations. Pedro Pascal, that depends. The audience immediately reacts. Whoopi Goldberg, there it is. Pedro Pascal, no, seriously. Whoopi Goldberg, explain. Pedro Pascal, because sometimes people say, dominating a conversation, when they really mean, I don't like who's speaking. Audience applause breaks out. Whoopi Goldberg leans back slightly. Whoopi Goldberg, that's an interesting distinction. Pedro Pascal, I think it's an important one. Whoopi Goldberg, but surely there are cases where celebrity culture overshadows actual expertise. Pedro Pascal, of course there are. Whoopi Goldberg, then isn't that a problem? Pedro Pascal, it's a media problem more than a celebrity problem. The audience reacts loudly. Whoopi Goldberg, a media problem. Pedro Pascal, yes. Whoopi Goldberg, explain that. Pedro Pascal, if an actor's opinion becomes a headline while an expert's research gets ignored, who's deciding what gets amplified? The audience applauds. Sunny Hostin, that's actually a strong point. Whoopi Goldberg, hold on. Pedro Pascal, okay. Whoopi Goldberg, you're putting the responsibility elsewhere. Pedro Pascal, not entirely. Whoopi Goldberg, it sounds like you are. Pedro Pascal, I'm saying responsibility is shared. Whoopi Goldberg, shared responsibility often becomes nobody's responsibility. The audience lets out another audible reaction. Pedro Pascal, that's not what I mean. Whoopi Goldberg, then what do you mean? Pedro Pascal, I mean that everyone plays a role. Public figures, media companies, audiences, all of us. Whoopi Goldberg, yet some voices have bigger microphones. Pedro Pascal, that's true. Whoopi Goldberg, which means some people carry greater responsibility. Pedro Pascal, that's also true. Whoopi Goldberg, then we're back where we started. Pedro Pascal laughs. Pedro Pascal, maybe we never left. Audience laughs. Joy Behar. This is my favorite kind of debate because neither person wants to back down. Pedro Pascal, I'm not trying to win. Whoopi Goldberg, neither am I. Joy Behar. That's exactly what people say when they're trying to win. The audience bursts into laughter. Pedro Pascal, fair enough. Whoopi Goldberg, let me ask you something directly. Pedro Pascal, okay. Whoopi Goldberg, do you think celebrities sometimes receive praise simply for saying things ordinary people say every day? The audience becomes noticeably attentive. Pedro Pascal, yes. Whoopi Goldberg, you do? Pedro Pascal, absolutely. Whoopi Goldberg, why? Pedro Pascal, because fame changes the way people hear things. Whoopi Goldberg, then doesn't fame distort public conversations? Pedro Pascal, sometimes it does. Whoopi Goldberg, so why participate? Pedro Pascal, because being famous doesn't remove your right to participate. The audience applauds. Whoopi Goldberg, nobody's questioning the right. Pedro Pascal, then what are we questioning? Whoopi Goldberg, the responsibility. Pedro Pascal, I keep saying responsibility matters. Whoopi Goldberg, and I keep hearing you stop just short of saying how much it matters. The audience reacts with another loud, ooh. For the first time, Pedro's smile fades slightly. Pedro Pascal, I think it matters a great deal. Whoopi Goldberg, then say that. Pedro Pascal, I just did. Whoopi Goldberg, after 20 minutes. Audience laughter fills the studio. Pedro Pascal shakes his head, laughing despite himself. Pedro Pascal, this is exactly why people get nervous coming on shows like this. The audience reacts immediately. Whoopi Goldberg raises an eyebrow. Whoopi Goldberg, because they're asked questions. Pedro Pascal, no. Whoopi Goldberg, then why? Pedro Pascal, because every answer becomes another test. The audience quiets. Whoopi Goldberg, public life is a test. Pedro Pascal, maybe that's the problem. The audience suddenly erupts with applause and murmurs. Whoopi Goldberg looks directly at him. Whoopi Goldberg, or maybe that's the reality. A tense silence hangs over the table. Pedro Pascal looks back at her. Pedro Pascal, sometimes reality deserves to be challenged. The audience gasps and applauds as the discussion takes an unexpectedly sharper turn, with both refusing to retreat from their positions. The applause continues for a few moments before Whoopi Goldberg leans forward again, clearly not ready to move on from the discussion. Whoopi Goldberg, you said something interesting a moment ago. Pedro Pascal, which part? Whoopi Goldberg, the part where you said reality deserves to be challenged. Pedro Pascal, I stand by that. Whoopi Goldberg, even when the reality is accountability. Pedro Pascal, accountability should never be beyond challenge. The audience reacts immediately. Whoopi Goldberg, really? Pedro Pascal, yes. Whoopi Goldberg, explain that. Pedro Pascal, accountability is important, but we should always ask whether it's being applied fairly. Sunny Hostin, that's a reasonable question. Whoopi Goldberg, fair enough. But let's talk about personal accountability. Pedro Pascal, okay. Whoopi Goldberg, when public figures make mistakes, do you think they spend too much time explaining and not enough time listening? Pedro Pascal, sometimes. Whoopi Goldberg, have you ever done that? Pedro Pascal pauses. Pedro Pascal, probably. Whoopi Goldberg, probably? Pedro Pascal, nobody gets everything right. Whoopi Goldberg, that's not an answer. Audience murmurs. Pedro Pascal, it is an answer. Whoopi Goldberg, not really. Pedro Pascal, then maybe we define accountability differently. Whoopi Goldberg, maybe we do. Joy Behar, here we go again. Audience laughs. Pedro Pascal, look, if you're asking whether I've made mistakes, absolutely. Whoopi Goldberg, I'm asking whether you've learned from them. Pedro Pascal, yes. Whoopi Goldberg, how do you know? Pedro Pascal, because I try not to repeat them. Whoopi Goldberg, everybody says that. Pedro Pascal, that's because it's true for most people. Whoopi Goldberg, is it? The audience lets out another collective reaction. Pedro Pascal shifts slightly in his chair. Pedro Pascal, you seem skeptical. Whoopi Goldberg, I've been around a long time. Pedro Pascal, that's fair. Whoopi Goldberg, I've watched public figures apologize, promise change, and then do the exact same thing 6 months later. Audience applause breaks out. Pedro Pascal, that happens. Whoopi Goldberg, more often than people admit. Pedro Pascal, maybe. Whoopi Goldberg, not maybe. It does. Pedro Pascal, okay. Whoopi Goldberg, so when audiences become cynical, can you blame them? Pedro Pascal, no. Whoopi Goldberg, then why do so many celebrities seem surprised when people question their sincerity? Pedro Pascal, because sincerity can't always be proven. The audience grows quiet. Whoopi Goldberg, that's convenient. Pedro Pascal, no, it's reality. Whoopi Goldberg, is it? Pedro Pascal, yes. Whoopi Goldberg, if someone changes their behavior, that's proof. Pedro Pascal, sometimes. Whoopi Goldberg, there you go again. Audience laughter erupts. Pedro Pascal laughs. Pedro Pascal, what? Whoopi Goldberg, every answer comes with a safety exit. Pedro Pascal, I don't think nuance is a safety exit. Audience applause follows. Sunny Hostin, that's actually an important distinction. Whoopi Goldberg, it can be. Pedro Pascal, why is nuance suddenly a bad thing? Whoopi Goldberg, because sometimes people hide behind it. The audience reacts. Pedro Pascal, And sometimes people ignore it because certainty sounds stronger. The crowd responds with even louder applause. Whoopi Goldberg pauses. Whoopi Goldberg, that's a good line. Pedro Pascal, it isn't a line. Whoopi Goldberg, it sounded like one. Pedro Pascal, I mean it. Whoopi Goldberg, I know. For a brief moment, the tension eases. Joy Behar. Can I just say this is probably one of the most serious interviews we've had in a while? Audience laughs. Alyssa Farah Griffin. Social media is probably already exploding. Pedro Pascal, that's comforting. Audience laughter spreads across the studio. Whoopi Goldberg, you joke, but it's true. Pedro Pascal, I know. Whoopi Goldberg. Every conversation becomes a headline now. Pedro Pascal, that's part of the problem. Whoopi Goldberg, or part of the job. Pedro Pascal, maybe both. Whoopi Goldberg, you see? That's what I'm talking about. Audience laughs again. Pedro Pascal, you're never going to let me answer in the middle, are you? Whoopi Goldberg, not today. The audience applauds. Pedro Pascal smiles before becoming serious again. Pedro Pascal, can I ask you something? Whoopi Goldberg, sure. Pedro Pascal, do you think public figures are held to standards that ordinary people couldn't meet? The audience immediately becomes attentive. Whoopi Goldberg, sometimes. Pedro Pascal, more than sometimes. Whoopi Goldberg, maybe. Pedro Pascal, there it is. Audience laughter erupts. Whoopi Goldberg laughs despite herself. Whoopi Goldberg, okay, fair. Pedro Pascal, I'm serious. Whoopi Goldberg, so am I. Pedro Pascal, people make mistakes. They say things imperfectly. They change their minds. That's part of being human. Whoopi Goldberg, true. Pedro Pascal, yet public figures are often expected to be perfect. Whoopi Goldberg, no. Pedro Pascal, no? Whoopi Goldberg, they're expected to be responsible. Audience applause follows. Pedro Pascal, those aren't always separated in public discussions. Whoopi Goldberg, maybe not. Pedro Pascal, that's what concerns me. Whoopi Goldberg, what concerns me is when influence becomes an excuse. The audience responds with loud applause. Pedro Pascal's expression tightens. Pedro Pascal, an excuse for what? Whoopi Goldberg, for avoiding responsibility. Pedro Pascal, I haven't argued against responsibility once. Whoopi Goldberg, you've argued around it. The audience gasps. Pedro Pascal looks genuinely surprised. Pedro Pascal, around it? Whoopi Goldberg, yes. Pedro Pascal, I disagree. Whoopi Goldberg, I know. Pedro Pascal, respectfully, I think you're hearing something I'm not saying. Whoopi Goldberg, and respectfully, I think you're saying less than you think you are. A loud ooh spreads through the audience. Sunny Hostin immediately jumps in. Sunny Hostin, okay, hold on. Joy Behar, yeah, let's not start a war here. Audience laughter helps ease the tension for a second. Pedro Pascal, no, it's okay. Whoopi Goldberg, I'm fine too. Pedro Pascal, here's why I disagree. Whoopi Goldberg nods. Pedro Pascal, I've repeatedly said accountability matters. Responsibility matters. Consequences matter. Whoopi Goldberg, right. Pedro Pascal, what I'm questioning is whether we apply those principles consistently. The audience applauds. Pedro Pascal, some people get endless second chances. Whoopi Goldberg, that's true. Pedro Pascal, others get none. Whoopi Goldberg, that's also true. Pedro Pascal, that's worth discussing. Whoopi Goldberg, it is. Pedro Pascal, that's all I've been saying. Whoopi Goldberg studies him for a moment. Whoopi Goldberg, then maybe we've been having two different arguments. Audience laughter breaks out. Pedro Pascal, I think that's exactly what's been happening. Joy Behar, it only took 30 minutes to figure that out. The audience roars with laughter. Whoopi Goldberg smiles slightly. Whoopi Goldberg, maybe. Pedro Pascal, maybe? Whoopi Goldberg, don't start. Audience laughter and applause fill the studio again. But despite the laughs, the atmosphere remains charged. Whoopi Goldberg looks toward Pedro one more time. Whoopi Goldberg, you know what? I still think you're avoiding one question. Pedro Pascal, which one? Whoopi Goldberg, whether influence changes your obligation to the public. The audience quiets immediately. Pedro Pascal takes a breath. Pedro Pascal, it does. Whoopi Goldberg, then we're finally getting somewhere. The crowd erupts into applause as both sit forward in their chairs, knowing the conversation has reached its most important point yet. and that the final part may determine whether they leave the table in agreement or with an even bigger disagreement than before. The applause continues as the audience senses the conversation has reached its turning point. Whoopi Goldberg, all right, let's finish this. Pedro Pascal, let's do it. Whoopi Goldberg, you just said influence changes your obligation to the public. Pedro Pascal, it does. Whoopi Goldberg, then what does that obligation look like? Pedro Pascal, being thoughtful, being informed, being willing to accept criticism when it comes. Whoopi Goldberg, and when criticism is unfair. Pedro Pascal, then you still listen before you dismiss it. Audience applause follows. Whoopi Goldberg, that's probably the most direct answer you've given all morning. Pedro Pascal, maybe I finally figured out what you were asking. Audience laughter breaks out. Whoopi Goldberg, maybe I finally figured out how to ask it. The audience applauds. Sunny Hostin, look at that. Progress. Joy Behar, we witnessed a breakthrough on live television. Audience laughter fills the studio. Pedro Pascal, don't get too excited. Whoopi Goldberg, fair enough. Pedro Pascal, I still think public conversations have become too focused on punishment. Whoopi Goldberg, and I still think people sometimes underestimate the consequences of influence. Pedro Pascal, that's fair. Whoopi Goldberg, that's fair too. The audience applauds as the tension begins to ease. Alyssa Farah Griffin, can I just say something? Whoopi Goldberg, go ahead. Alyssa Farah Griffin, I think what people are responding to is that both of you are talking about responsibility from different directions. Pedro Pascal, that's exactly it. Whoopi Goldberg, I can agree with that. Sunny Hostin, nobody here is saying people shouldn't speak. Whoopi Goldberg, correct. Sunny Hostin, and nobody here is saying accountability doesn't matter. Pedro Pascal, correct. Joy Behar, so we spent half the show discovering everybody agrees. Audience laughter erupts once again. Pedro Pascal, that's television. Whoopi Goldberg, that's life. The audience applauds loudly. Pedro Pascal, you know, I actually appreciate conversations like this. Whoopi Goldberg, even this one. Pedro Pascal, especially this one. Whoopi Goldberg, why? Pedro Pascal, because disagreement doesn't have to mean hostility. The audience responds with one of the biggest applause breaks of the segment. Whoopi Goldberg nods. Whoopi Goldberg, I agree with that completely. Pedro Pascal, people have forgotten that you can challenge someone without hating them. Whoopi Goldberg, that's true. Pedro Pascal, and you can defend your position without treating somebody else like an enemy. Audience applause grows even louder. Sunny Hostin, that's probably the message people need to hear. Joy Behar, especially online. Audience laughter follows. Whoopi Goldberg, online might be a lost cause. Pedro Pascal, I hope not. Whoopi Goldberg, I said might be. Pedro Pascal, fair enough. The audience laughs. A producer signals that the segment is nearly over. Whoopi Goldberg notices and looks toward the camera. Whoopi Goldberg, we only have a minute left. Joy Behar, that's probably for the best. Audience laughter fills the studio. Pedro Pascal, are you saying you want me gone? Joy Behar, I'm saying I need a nap after this conversation. The audience roars with laughter. Whoopi Goldberg, before we wrap up, is there anything you'd like viewers to take away from this? Pedro Pascal pauses for a moment. Pedro Pascal, just that conversations matter. The audience quiets. Pedro Pascal, not the easy ones. Not the ones where everybody already agrees. The difficult ones. Whoopi Goldberg nods. Pedro Pascal, listen. Challenge people. Defend your ideas. But actually hear each other. Audience applause spreads across the studio. Whoopi Goldberg, that's a good place to end. Pedro Pascal, I hope so. Whoopi Goldberg, thank you for being here. Pedro Pascal, thank you for having me. The audience rises for a standing ovation as the segment comes to a close. Whoopi Goldberg, we'll be right back. Applause. As the show heads to commercial, audience members continue talking among themselves about the discussion they just witnessed. Some are clearly on Whoopi's side. Others are defending Pedro's position. But nearly everyone agrees it was one of the most intense conversations of the morning. Within minutes, clips from the exchange begin circulating online. Social media users debate who made the stronger argument. Some viewers praise Whoopi Goldberg for pressing difficult questions and refusing to let the discussion stay on the surface. Others applaud Pedro Pascal for remaining calm under pressure and continuing to engage even when the questions became more challenging. Comment sections quickly fill with thousands of reactions. One viewer writes, "This is what talk shows are supposed to be. Real conversations." Another comments, "Pedro never lost his composure." A different viewer responds, "Whoopi asked exactly the questions that needed to be asked." As clips continue spreading throughout the day, media outlets begin covering the exchange, highlighting the moments that generated the strongest audience reactions. By that evening, the interview has become one of the most discussed television moments of the day. Sources close to the production later described the atmosphere backstage as surprisingly positive. Despite the heated discussion on camera, Pedro Pascal and the hosts reportedly continue talking after the show ends. There is no shouting, no drama, and no lingering hostility. Instead, there is mutual respect for a conversation that challenged everyone involved. For many viewers, that becomes the biggest takeaway. The exchange wasn't memorable because people were angry. It was memorable because people disagreed openly, defended their views, and continued listening to one another. And in today's media environment, that may be the rarest outcome of all. What do you think? Did Whoopi Goldberg make the stronger argument? Or do you agree more with Pedro Pascal's perspective? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the Star Talks for more real talk show stories.